Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the absolute roller coaster ride of how Islamic history was recorded, preserved, and honestly, at one point, nearly wiped off the map forever. It's a crazy story full of incredible innovation, devastating destruction, and choices that literally shifted the balance of global power. Let's get into it. When we hear stories about the early days of Islam, these massive, epic battles and huge shifts in empires, you really have to wonder, where exactly are we getting these accounts from? How on earth did they survive centuries of war and shifting dynasties? It wasn't just a guy sitting comfortably at a desk with a pen and paper.
Believe it or not, for the first few decades, history wasn't written down at all. During the era of the first caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, there was zero need for written history. Why? Because the actual eyewitnesses to these massive historical events were still walking around. It was living memory. But as you can imagine, that wasn't going to last forever.
Which brings us to part one, recording the early history. Time passes, right? And as the original companions of the Prophet began to pass away, a quiet but serious crisis started brewing. The new generation was forgetting. They were losing touch with foundational events like the battles of Badr and Uhud. The youth were actually idolizing Roman and Persian figures like Hercules and Rustam, while their very own heroes, legends like Khalid bin Walid and Ali, were just fading from collective memory. So, to stop this cultural amnesia, Caliph Omar bin Abdulaziz stepped in. He commissioned a brilliant scholar named Ibn Shihab al-Zuhiri to compile the very first written history. But tragically, because of extreme political instability and the total collapse of the Umayyad dynasty, that pioneering first book was completely lost to time. That leads us right into part two. The paper revolution begins. Okay, so now we're in the Abbasid Caliphate, hanging out in their spectacular new capital of Baghdad. Caliph al-Mansur says to the scholar Ibn Ishaq, "We need you to rewrite our history." But they hit a massive physical roadblock. Back then, writing meant painstakingly using papyrus or stitching together actual leaves. It was insanely expensive, incredibly hard to make, and super fragile. Now, the Chinese Empire had the secret recipe for making paper, but they guarded it with their lives. Until, out of nowhere, a massive battle between Muslim forces and a Chinese army changes the world forever. The Muslim forces captured prisoners of war, and it just so happened that among them were artisans who actually knew the top-secret papermaking process. This one twist of fate changed the trajectory of human history. Caliph Harun al-Rashid immediately capitalized on it. He builds the world's largest water-powered paper factory right there in Baghdad. And get this sudden technological leap gave the Muslim world a staggering 300-year head start over Europe in mass paper production. 3 whole centuries. And that sets the stage for part 3, Baghdad's Golden Age. With this explosion of cheap, accessible paper, we get what we now call the Islamic Golden Age. Suddenly, books are everywhere. They're being copied in huge markets, spreading globally. And the scholars writing them, they became absolute rock stars. Take Imam Tabari, for instance. He wrote this massive, epic history of the world all the way up to the Abbasid era. He was so deeply respected that his school actually presented him with a literal treasure trove of gold dinars as a reward. But Tabari famously flat out rejected the gold. He chose to keep his humble 10 dinar teaching wage, telling them, "This is my salary, I will not take a penny more." It was an incredible era driven by just a pure, unadulterated passion for knowledge.
Thanks to this affordable paper, scholarship basically spread like wildfire. You had guys like Ibn Hisham preserving those earlier lost works. You had al-Waqidi and his student Ibn Sa'd meticulously recording biographies. Imam Ibn Asakir? He cranked out a staggering 70-volume history while teaching over in Damascus. You even had scholars acting as frontline war correspondents, like Ibn al-Author, who was literally out there documenting Salahuddin Ayyubi's recapture of Jerusalem, while others were recording Sultan Ghori's campaigns in India.
But look, it wasn't just about frantically writing things down. It was about getting the story right. Strict neutrality and rigorous fact-checking were huge deals to these historians. For example, there was a politically charged book making the rounds at the time called Fadail Yazid, which was heavily biased propaganda trying to paint certain political figures as flawless heroes. While scholars like Imam Ibn al-Jawzi actively stepped up to debunk it, writing counter-narratives to make sure the historical record stayed accurate and truthful. But as history constantly reminds us, nothing lasts forever. Part 4, the fall of Baghdad. The end of this magnificent era was so sudden and absolutely horrific. While Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, is marching his terrifying, unstoppable army directly toward the city gates, the intellectuals of Baghdad were completely distracted. The historical sources tell us they were inside the city, wrapped up in utterly absurd philosophical arguments. They were literally debating things like how many angels could sit on the head of a pin, or what specific kind of bread Prophet Jesus ate. They were consumed by bitter sectarian debates between Shias and Sunnis, completely blind to the very real, existential threat knocking at their door. When the Mongols breached the walls, the destruction was absolute. It wiped out 400 years of progress almost overnight. The historical accounts are chilling. They say the Tigris River first turned red with the blood of the slaughtered citizens, regardless of any sectarian divides they had. Then, the legendary House of Wisdom was burned to the ground. Thousands upon thousands of books were hurled into the river, turning the water black with ink for days. And finally, every single paper factory, the very engine of their entire golden age, was completely destroyed. So how do you come back from that? Let's look at part 5, rebuilding through knowledge. The devastation was so absolute that the Muslim world was actually forced into the incredibly humbling position of importing paper from Europe just to survive intellectually. Yet, amazingly, operating right there in the ruins of a fallen empire, some towering intellectual figures emerged. Scholars like Ibn Kathir authored massive encyclopedic histories. And then you have Ibn Khaldun, who pioneered totally groundbreaking sociological and historical analysis. His methodologies were so far ahead of their time that his foundational volume, the Muqaddimah, is quite literally still taught at prestigious universities like Harvard and Oxford today, and a major modern Turkish university is even named in his honor. But right as they were bouncing back, we hit a massive turning point. Part 6, the printing press blunder. Just as the Muslim world was producing its last great classical scholars, Europe hits a technological home run that would flip the balance of global power forever. Let's look at the numbers. In the Muslim world, a highly skilled scholar handwriting a manuscript could maybe churn out 40 pages in a single day. But over in Europe, Johannes Gutenberg invents the mechanical printing press. Suddenly, Europe is producing 4,000 printed pages a day. The math is just undeniable. It was a total revolution in mass communication. Now, the new superpower of the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, had a critical choice to make. And in what is now viewed as one of history's most catastrophic blunders, they banned it. They straight up declared the printing machine forbidden. Elite scholars argued that true, pure knowledge could only flow from a human hand and a pen, definitely not some cold metal machine. They dismissed it as a foreign invention. But if we're being real, underlying all of this was a deep-seated fear of losing control. They were terrified of the political consequences. I mean, what happens to the power of the elite if the general public suddenly gets unlimited, cheap access to books and information? And because of that single decision, you see two sharply diverging paths. While the leaders of the Muslim world were focusing their massive wealth and energy on building breathtakingly beautiful architectural monuments like the Taj Mahal, Europe was going in a totally different direction. Empowered by the printing press, they were building universities, spreading mass literacy, and churning out revolutionary scientists like Galileo, Da Vinci, and Newton. Now, do you remember that 300-year head start the Muslim world got back when they adopted paper? Well, history has a wild sense of irony. It took the Ottoman Empire exactly 300 years to realize their absolutely catastrophic mistake and finally allow the construction of a printing press. But by then, the train had left the station. The center of global intellectual and scientific dominance had permanently shifted to Europe. Which leaves us with this final, profound thought to really chew on today. Looking at this entire journey, from the soaring intellectual heights of the House of Wisdom to the tragic, self-inflicted wound of the printing press ban, we have to ask ourselves, what ultimately happens to a civilization when it just stops adapting? When it outlaws innovation out of fear and lets its thirst for knowledge run dry? It's a hugely powerful lesson from history, and honestly, one that feels just as relevant today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.